On Friday, November 17th, 1978, 4 teenagers were working inside this building right here. It was known as Burger Chef Restaurant here in Speedway, Indiana.
They closed the shop down at 11 o'clock. At midnight, another worker came by. He was going to meet up with those teenagers, hang out with them that night. They were nowhere to be found. As a matter of fact, they would never be seen alive again. This is a case 43 years later that has still not been solved. This case was botched by the police right from the start. We're going to tell you more, show you more of the locations, and we cordially invite you to come along. When the off-duty worker arrived at the empty restaurant at 5725 Crawfordsville Road in Speedway around midnight, he noticed some things he found to be very odd. The lights in the building were still on, and the main door was unlocked. When he went inside the building, he saw the restaurant safe was wide open with no money inside. About $580 was missing, but there were still about $100 worth of coins in the register. The back door to the building was open, even though it wasn't used very often, and of course, his 4 teenage co-workers were missing. So he called his manager and then the police. When police arrived, they figured out the Chevy Vega car of the assistant manager, who was 20-year-old Jane Freet, was gone. Jane was a busy young lady. In addition to her assistant manager job, she was also in band, choir, gymnastics, drama, and was part of the yearbook staff at her school. She was also a library assistant and a teacher's aide. Inside the restaurant, police found several items belonging to the 4 workers, including coats and purses. It was a cold night, so seeing the coats still there was very strange. Murders rarely happened at Speedway at the time. That, combined with the fact typically when fast food restaurants are robbed, which happens quite a bit, the thieves hurry in and out, and rarely is there a kidnapping involved. So police made the unfortunate decision that the kids had stolen the money from the restaurant and taken off to have some fun on the town that night. Police left without taking any photos of the scene. To make matters worse, the morning crew showed up at the restaurant for the next day's shift and cleaned up the restaurant to get it ready for the new day. As they cleaned, potential clues, fingerprints, and other evidence was wiped away. By the time Saturday afternoon rolled around and none of the teens showed up at their houses or at work, the families began to get very worried. At some point that day, the Chevy Vega belonging to Freet was found in town just a block and a half from the Speedway Police Department with the passenger door unlocked. Police finally began to think something far worse may have happened. They staged the restaurant to look how they remembered it from the night before and took pictures. They didn't bother to mention this to investigators, who at first assumed the pictures were from the night of the murders, until one of the investigators noticed rays of sunlight in one of the pictures. Only then did they realize the pictures had been staged. Later on Saturday, with the help of the police, people began to form search parties looking for the teens. By Sunday, the story started to spread throughout the state of Indiana. The Indianapolis News put the story on the front page with the headline, "4 Missing After Speedway Robbery." That afternoon, the families of the missing teens had gotten very little sleep and were hoping their kids would soon be found. Robert Flemons was the father of missing 16-year-old Mark Flemons. Mark would have been working in the back of the restaurant as a cook on the night he disappeared. He was the youngest child of 7, all being raised in a Jehovah's Witness household. He had a difficult freshman year of high school, but was doing much better in his sophomore year. He lived close to the Burger Chef and was able to walk to and from work. His father said a conversation he had with his son one evening while they were watching television was stuck in his head. They had watched a show where someone was kidnapped. After watching it, Mark looked at his dad and said he would figure out a way to escape if someone were to ever kidnap him. He said, "I wouldn't lay still and die." He added that he would run away from the kidnappers, bobbing and weaving, so he'd be hard to hit. That same day, a couple was going on a hike through a wooded area near their house. They spotted the bodies in this area.
We've now driven 30 minutes south of the Burger Chef restaurant to Timber Heights subdivision in Greenwood, Indiana.
Now, this was not Timber Heights subdivision back 43 years ago. This was actually just wooded area, similar to what you see right down there. All through here would have just been woods, and somewhere in this area, there was a gravel road of some sort. It was an area where teenagers probably hung out and partied. This is the spot where apparently the murders took place and also where the bodies were found. There were 3 different methods used in murdering the 4. The bodies of 18-year-old Ruth Ellen Shelton and 16-year-old Daniel Davis were found face down next to each other just off a gravel path. Both had been shot in the head and neck multiple times. Shelton was a junior at Northwest High School and an honor student, double majoring in business and math, who had hopes of landing at a good college in a few years. She wanted to get a degree in computer science. She was active in her church and loved to sing. Davis was a junior at Decatur Central High School. He was new on the night shift at Burger Chef after being moved to that shift just a week earlier when another worker quit. He had planned to enlist in the U.S. Air Force after graduation. Jane's body was found about 75 yards away from Shelton and Davis. She still had the blade from the large knife inside her chest after being stabbed so hard by the killer that the handle had broken off of the knife. She was stabbed twice in the heart. Mark Flemons was found far away from the others, near the main road, on his back, near the creek. He had been beaten by a chain in the head. It seems he did exactly what he had told his father he would do, running away, bobbing and weaving, and escaping his kidnappers. Sadly, he ran into a tree in the darkness of the night and fell on his back. He choked to death on his own blood. He apparently would have survived and been a live witness if he would have simply landed on his side or stomach. All of the victims still had their Burger Chef uniforms on. They also had valuable items such as watches and money still on them. When police arrived, they continued to make mistakes. The area wasn't roped off. Indiana State Police officers apparently moved some of the bodies before forensic investigators and the coroner arrived, and police cars were driven all over the area, potentially destroying more evidence. There were too many officials on scene as members of the Johnson County Sheriff Department, Indiana State Patrol, and Speedway Police all showed up at the site. On Monday, November 20th, a $25,000 reward was offered by Burger Chef for information leading to the arrest of the killer or killers. The restaurant Steak and Shake threw in an additional $1,000 for the reward. Unfortunately, the police, instead of working together between the 3 agencies, were doing just the opposite, and not even sharing information with each other. Robert Copeland was Speedway Police Chief at the time. Even though police were not sharing any information from the investigation with the public, Copeland did come out and say his department didn't do anything wrong. He even said his department did the right thing, allowing the Burger Chef to reopen just hours after multiple workers had gone missing. Officer William Bergen was the assistant police chief at the time, and he said the entire department was a huge mess under Copeland. The town ended up firing Copeland a year after the killings.
Eventually, a 16-year-old witness arrived at the police department to tell police he had seen 2 suspicious-looking men in the parking lot of the restaurant sometime between 11:15 and 11:30 on the night of the murders. The boy had been sitting behind the building with his girlfriend. The teen described the men as shabbily dressed white men who both appeared to be in their 30s. One of the men had a beard and the other was clean-shaven and fair-haired. The clean-shaven guy was acting strange, looking at the ground and covering part of his face with some sort of bandana. The bearded man walked up to the teens and asked for their ID cards. Then he told them to leave the area because a lot of vandalism has been going on around here. The teens left quickly. Police created clay models of the men. About a month later, a man at a bar told some friends he took part in the Burger Chef murders. Police brought the man in, but he passed a polygraph. However, he did tell police about some men he knew who were involved in robbing fast food restaurants in the area. One of the men had a beard and looked like the man in the sketch. Police brought him in for questioning and to put him in a lineup. The man shaved his beard. It was the first time anyone who knew him could remember him shaving his beard in at least 5 years. Another man was also called in, who looked similar to the model of the clean-shaven man. He had done time for robbing fast food restaurants previously. A third man who went by the name of Shotgun, because he liked to use a shotgun while robbing places, was also called in. Apparently, all 3 of the men had been part of a group who were robbing quite a few fast food restaurants at the time, including several Burger Chefs. They seemed to have figured out how the stores were shut down each night and knew just the right moment to make their move for the money. Police tried to cut a deal with each of the three men, but none of the men would take a deal. All three men were eventually let go due to lack of evidence to tie them to the murders. After this, the case went cold. Finally, about 15 months later, in March of 1979, police began to look into a man by the name of Roger Dale Stafford. After finding out he killed some fast food workers in Oklahoma, he was moved down the list of suspects when they couldn't place him in Indiana at the time of the murders. Jane's brother was arrested in 1981 on drug-related charges. Police came up with a theory that he could have been part of the murder, with drugs playing a role in it. After several days of investigating that theory, police removed him from the suspect list. Very little happened with the case for the next 2 years. Then in 1983, an inmate got in touch with the sheriff's office to confess to the murders. He told police he was a drug enforcer. He said he went to the restaurant to collect a debt for the drugs owed by one of the teens. He was recognized by one of the other teens, so then he felt he needed to kill them all. Police decided the story probably wasn't true, and there was no evidence of him being the killer. A year later in 1984, which was by then 6 years after the murder, another inmate by the name of Donald Forrester contacted the Marion County Sheriff's Office to confess to the crime. He was willing to make a deal with police where he would give them information about the killings in exchange for not being sent to the Indiana State Prison, which was known at the time as a very violent place. At first, police weren't too sure about making a deal, but soon he began to give them accurate information. He led them to the spot the bodies were found and described the positions the bodies were found in. He also mentioned the fact a knife had been broken off in Jane's chest. That fact had not been released by the police at the time. He said that he had gone to Burger Chef along with 3 other of his associates to collect money from Jane that her brother James owed. When he arrived, he argued with her. Then Flemons got in the way. There was a fight, and Flemons was knocked unconscious. Once that happened, the men felt they had no choice but to take all 4 of the workers and kill them so there wouldn't be any witnesses. He said after the murders, he took the gun and tossed it into a river. He took police to the spot. Police searched it but couldn't find the weapon. Then he said he flushed the .38 caliber bullet casings from the murder weapon down the toilet at the house he was living in at the time. Investigators then interviewed his wife. She said she did remember a day around the time of the murders when her husband had taken her on a trip out into the country. At one point, he stopped the car near a field and found some shell casings. Then he took them home and put them in the toilet. That was enough for police to get a search warrant for the septic tank at the house. When they searched the septic tank, they did end up finding 3 .38 caliber casings in the tank. Not long after that, for whatever reason, someone leaked information that Forrester was an informant for the police. Once he found out, he would never speak of the case again, and would claim he was fooled into confession by the police. Since there was no actual evidence tying him to the murders, police were forced to move on to other suspects. Forrester died while in jail in 2006 from cancer, taking with him to the grave any information he may have had about the murders. We're at the grave of Mark Flemons. His family was poor at the time of his death and wasn't able to afford a headstone, so his grave was unmarked for several decades. Then in January of 2015, a group on Twitter raised enough money to have one put on his grave. Now we're at Leonard Park, which is located right next to the Speedway Police Department. Some people in the area decided they wanted to do something special for the 40th anniversary of the murders. They began to raise money to have a plaque installed for each of the victims. They raised all the money they needed on the first day and ended up with extra money, which they used to put in this marble bench as well, which is dedicated to the family and friends of the teenagers. Ruth Ellen Shelton's mom, Rachel, passed away several years ago, but before she died, she said she hoped the killers, if still alive, would confess their sins to God. She told local news, "I would love to see the people who are still alive and guilty realize that today, Jesus is calling them to give their lives over to Him."